Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. If you haven't been listening, I'd like to just remind you that we are back on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. By joining the History of the Papacy on Patreon, not only are you getting great bonus content, ad-free content, inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, monthly book drawings, and more, you are also really going a long way to helping this whole operation continue to go. We're getting close to hitting some major goals in the podcast and its whole life. And I would really appreciate it if you would consider joining in this new year and a new series. There are 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, each with their own benefits. But with that, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Dr. Carolyn McNamara joins us again to discuss how the society of the ancient Celts was organized. We will also begin to discuss aspects of pre-Christian religion in Ireland. Dr. McNamara will show the importance of kingship in Ireland. She will also begin to show how Christianity and society in Ireland evolved in different ways compared to Britain, being that there was less influence and direct influence from the Roman Empire on Ireland and these other areas in the British Isles that never fell under Roman control. Send your questions for Dr. McNamara to me, Steve, at a2zhistorypage.com, or connect on social media by searching for A2Z History. I'd also really appreciate it if you sent in a rating and review on iTunes. It definitely helps me know what you're enjoying about the show and helps others learn about the show. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Before we move on, something that kind of came into my mind is we have Celtic as a term. Then we have Caesar would have called them Gauls, or he often referred to them as Gauls. And then you have the people who are living up in Ireland and Britain that are being called something different. How are all these names and all these different terms for them interrelated? If somebody back in the day, if somebody like Caesar, would Celt and Gaul have been a synonym for him? And then what was happening up in Britain, would he have considered that as something completely different and just using Caesar as maybe an archetype?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So it really seems like the Greek world used Keltoi as their term. The Latin world or the Romans used this Keltai, Galli word. And so as I said, we don't ever really see Britain and Ireland called, like, they're not called Gaul, they're not called Galli. We've got this Hiberniae, and Hibernia is what Ireland is frequently called. We also see Ireland called Scotti, and that kind of seems to be a word that means something similar to pirate almost, which would make sense as we see kind of raiding happening from Ireland into Roman Britain. And then we've got in the far north of Britain, the Picts. These are all Celtic language peoples, but the Roman sources never really call them as such. They've got Britannia or the Britannic Isles when they're searching for tin. There's abundant tin in Britain. And, the word Britain itself comes from a Celtic word, Pryden, but there's some kind of separation between Gaul and Britannia, Hibernia, that I'm not quite sure how that is understood.
What did the Celts, what did they look like to the Romans, at least into our sources, physically, and then their material culture?
Sure. So the men, as I've mentioned, tend to have this long hair that we're told that they washed their hair with lime and would style it by combing it straight back from their forehead towards the back of the neck. So this kind of long, just combed back hair with these long mustaches. They sometimes mention that, the food would get stuck in their mustaches and they were totally fine with that. So you can see from sculpture in Scotland that the higher status figures on some of the sculpture is those that has the longer hair, the bigger mustache. So kind of the long-haired guys are the important guys. They get the fancier clothing and the better arms and armor on the sculpture, which is, I think, quite amusing. They're described as rather, large people, and that the women would stand right next to the men in battle, that they would wear colorful clothing and would adorn themselves with gold, lots of gold, and that they would wear trousers and tunics, and even the women wore trousers and tunics.
It's interesting. I don't know where I read this. I'll have to go back and look, but I believe that something that the Celts or those groups invented trousers or pants.
I've heard that, but I've not seen the evidence for it. So that's one of those things that maybe we'll have to do some research on and see if we can track down any source evidence for that.
Because it seems like kind of a silly invention, like, oh, pants, but pants are kind of a big leap, like for riding horses and for doing a lot of things. They're a lot more practical than wearing a tunic, or especially in a cold weather situation. I want to believe that they invented pants. We're going to have to look into that one more.
Yeah, I think so.
So, now we have Celtic culture, and I think everybody has very certain ideas in their mind. What are maybe some of the more wilder claims about them?
Yeah, I think this is a good one. And I want to mention really quick before we get into this that, thinking of this colonization, this imperialism that Rome is pushing out into these Celtic lands, that they had a vested interest in making these kind of brash, broad brush claims about the enduring and unchangeable nature of these peoples that they're trying to control and bring them, quote unquote, civilization. So we want to keep all of that in mind. And that kind of concept we can even take into the modern period when we're thinking about, American imperialism or British imperialism, what kind of similar vested interest peoples and governments had in these same perspectives. So one of the big ones is that the Celts were violent and war-loving. Again, this is pretty typical of almost any kind of Western attempts to justify a violent takeover of, othered people, which we can see in the Americas, Africa, Australia, Micronesia, kind of all over the place. So the Romans claimed that the behavior that Celtic peoples exhibited in response to Roman aggression was actually an overarching and unchanging cultural characteristic that was kind of frozen in time. And this is where the idea of the barbarian was useful. The Celts were described as primitive, animalistic, unable to control their emotions, and thus divorced from the historical context in which these interactions with Rome occurred. They're also called melodramatic, drunken, like they just loved to drink and would drink to excess, and to the point that they would get into fights that would ultimately lead in death. There's a story that claimed that any baby that was born to a Celtic woman and man would be washed in the Rhine, and that the dad wouldn't claim the child as its own until the baby had successfully been washed in the Rhine. That they would build these large structures. If you've seen the 1973 movie Wicker Man, basically just like that. There were claims that they would build these large structures and put people in them to burn them as offerings. Claims that they ate human flesh. Celtic men were often kind of hypersexualized, and there would be claims of preference for homosexuality among the men. But also they would claim that the sharing of wives would happen, or that be okay with proposition random people for sex. So there were all of these really interesting but definitely odd claims to this kind of enduring culture that they claimed for these, barbaric Celts.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in there. I mean, I think of the drunkenness. I have to imagine that the Celts had some sort of alcohol that they made because, I mean, basically every culture, agricultural culture, has made some sort of alcohol. So why they would be more drunken than anybody else seems unusual.
Yeah, and there's a number of stories about, this behavior when these Celtic peoples are drinking. But as you say, pretty much everyone had developed their own kind of alcoholic beverage. And we do see something that continues through of some important ritualistic, behaviors that involve whether it's beer or mead or other such things. Celtic peoples imported wine from Rome. Like they had access to the usual things, and maybe it's just an othering of cultural behavior that these Greeks and Romans are seeing contexts in which, alcohol is drunk, and social norms that dictate behaviors in these kind of feasting, experiences that they're going, oh, well, that's not what we expect. So this must be something to do with the drink that's leading them.
And now a word from our sponsors. And then this is probably an episode of its own, but the Romans and the Greeks always have a problem with other people with homosexuality, but homosexuality didn't seem to be a big deal to them. And maybe it's a context mismatch.
I wonder what exactly that stems from, and maybe a classicist would be able to talk to that better. But yeah, they definitely had situations wherein homosexual behavior happened, and we don't see huge cultural outcries against that within Rome, although, which aspect of that homosexual relationship you were apparently, spoke to your honor or your status. But yeah, maybe there's a little bit of projection going on there.
Yeah, I think so many of those things, they come down to maybe even the writer's personal judgment value. If somebody drinks a little bit more than them, well, they're a sloppy drunk, and I completely control myself.
Right. Yeah, I think that we have to consider the possibility of how much that would affect what someone is saying.
Oh, you know what? This is just a little sidebar. I think it might be fun to talk about that movie Wicker Man at some point. We'll put that in the back. That is something else.
It's a really good movie. I like it a lot. I haven't seen the remake. It doesn't exist to me.
No, I don't think I could watch the remake. Now, this is a great topic here about the Celts. We've talked so much about their other aspects of their culture, and we've been talking about what other people wrote about them, but what about writing themselves? How literate were they?
Yeah, this is a great question. Again, when we think in our popular conception of the Celts, we're thinking of, again, these barbarian peoples who were illiterate, esteemed these Druids, completely. But we've got evidence of some of the literate nature of them. So Caesar himself kind of gives us a little bit of both sides of this. He tells us that they kept their sacred knowledge oral, and even that people would go to, I think it was Anglesey, he mentioned, to spend upwards of 20 years sometimes. And I think elsewhere someone else says 30 years of training in order to take up this position of Druid, which was like a really high status society. But that outside of this sacred knowledge, they would use Greek letters. We also have actual evidence of Celtic people themselves writing. So there are inscriptions from Gaul that are religious inscriptions. There's the tablet of Chemalier, which is written in a Roman cursive script on lead and deposited in a sacred spring around 50 AD. We've got the tablet of Larzac, which is again written in a Roman cursive script on lead in this time deposited in a woman's around 9. We've got short inscriptions on everyday items such as spindle whorls or drinking vessels. These inscriptions can use Latin letters, Greek letters, or even Phoenician script. So we see this kind of wide range of, I think it's likely that whichever society they tended to be a little more interactive with, whether it was Romans, Greeks, or Phoenicians, that would kind of take up that script. And we can see some of this use in everyday work. So there's evidence from these potters that you'd have a group of potters and they'd each have their own kiln, but in an effort to kind of reduce their own personal risk, they would kind of mix up their items to each of the kilns. So if one had, let's say, catastrophic failure, it wasn't just that the guy whose kiln it was lost everything. They'd kind of share in this loss. So what they would do is they'd take the shards of some of the broken pots and they would write on the bottom of it to talk about, okay, so this is this person's name and this is how many items they have in this kiln. And they just make a little list. And they include Celtic names. They include inscriptions that mix Latin and Gaulish. So we can see even craftspeople are using writing, and they're using it in contexts that are mixing Celtic speakers and non-Celtic speakers, because not everyone's got a Celtic name in it. One of the most famous examples, I think, is probably the curse tablets from Bath, which I think are fantastic. So that's in England, and basically what that shows is you've got hundreds of tablets, and while a lot of them are in Latin, you see many Celtic names, a few Latin letters, but are not writing in the Latin language, and they're not standardized handwriting. So it seems like everybody wrote their own tablet and then put it in the bath. And so that tells us that they don't have one or two guys whose job it is, you bring your tablet and that guy writes it for you, that it's really widespread, this ability to write things for yourself. And you also get curse tablets from Switzerland as well. And then we've got evidence from Diodorus Siculus, another Roman writer, who talks about how sometimes when a family member would die, people would put letters to their relatives onto that funeral pyre with the expectation that the content of that letter would then reach their loved one in their afterlife or their next life. And then the last example I have is the Coligny calendar from Burgundy, France, which is late 2nd century AD. That is a calendar, and it's really impressive in my mind and gives us a lot of Celtic words within itself.
There's so much that we could go into that. I mean, that little bit of on writing. I mean, I'm sure many a person has done a whole career on those.
Right.
So we really couldn't do that justice today. But I think because that will play well into what we're going to talk about next in the Celtic society, because that's going to be so important going into this whole series. What can we say about, and what do we know about the just Celtic society in general?
Yeah, and this is another one that we're getting a lot of information from our Greek and Roman. It's hard to get information about society from archaeology. But we know that it was a stratified society. It was hierarchical. We know towards the very top were the Druids, and then as part of their, intelligentsia class is how I kind of perceive of them. You've also got the poets or the bards and the seers or the vate. So the Druids, we're told, were powerful enough that they could step between two armies and command them to stop, and everybody would stop. They held, one of, if not the highest position in society. They were greatly respected, maybe sometimes feared. As I mentioned previously, says they spent 20 years in training for this role. They were vital for proper sacrifices to be made. They settled disputes. They gave advice to kings. Cicero tells us that he personally knew a Druid named Divitacus the Aeduan, who was well-versed in knowledge of the natural world. So they were not only keepers of this, sacred knowledge that comes down to them on, the supernatural world, but also they were interested in astronomy and the natural world as well. You've got your poets and your bards who are telling stories and tales and are important for the status of kings. And there's the belief that their satire can physically harm the person that satire is written about. And
That's
I think
interesting.
that's a really interesting one. And then your seers, your vates were really involved in divination. And then we've got our king. So at this point, we're looking at a sacral kingship. So the king was ritually chosen and wed to the land. There's a number of stories about this kind of sacred choosing of the king. But the quality of the king's rule was directly tied to the prosperity of the land and its people. So if the land isn't doing well, then they're probably going to blame the king. Or if the king isn't doing well, they're probably going to be worried that the land is going to start not doing well also. We can see the importance of generosity in a king through the story of Luernius, which we get from Posidonius. He talks about how, in an attempt to gain the favor of the populace, he rode through the fields distributing gold and silver. He also enclosed a huge feasting area, which we're told is over 2 kilometers on each side, which lasted for, we're just told, many days. And another version of the story, I think they say a full year, in which they continually served anybody who turned up. So if you just happened to be wandering by, you got to come and be part of the feast. So right after the feast ends, a poet turns up and realizes that he's just missed out. So he composed a song praising Luernius's generosity and lamenting his own tardiness. And then Luernius gives a bag of gold to this poet, and the poet then immediately creates a new song, again in praise of the king. So in this, we can see both the importance of generosity on the part of the king, but also this reciprocal relationship that exists between these poets and the poets can be part of, increasing the status of a king, or if we believe that satire may physically harm them, then, being satirized by a poet could be really damaging. We also see descriptions of the warrior hierarchy. So the most powerful warriors get what's called the champion's portion of meat. That's something that can even lead to disputes or brawls. There's a medieval Irish story called Scalamuco Macdetho, or the story of Macdetho's pig, which really is kind of centered on this argument of who gets the champion's portion of meat. We're told about battle customs. So before a battle starts, they would recite the great deeds of their ancestors and themselves, and then mock their opponents. There is archaeological evidence to suggest that they did keep and preserve the heads of their enemies for display, and that this was something that would increase their own status. And we're told that they would fight with chariots, spears, long swords, shields. So we get some of this material culture in these stories that we can maybe compare with when we find it in the archaeological record.
And now a word from our sponsors. Now, I know I have a question or two about the Druids, but I think the Druids are going to come up quite a bit in future episodes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so.
So we'll definitely hold off on that. And if people are listening out there and have questions about the Druids, definitely send those in. I think there's probably it's worth talking about women and the role of women, because I think oftentimes people say, well, oh, the Celts, they were women were so much more equal in their society than the misogynist Romans and Greeks. Is there truth to that, or was their role different?
I think there's a degree of truth to it, but not nearly so much as has become the popular belief. In these classical sources, we're still told that a man had ultimate power over the life of his wife, so he could choose for her to die if he wanted. But if you're comparing kind of the role of women in the societies versus in Roman society or Greek society, where women are very closely associated with the home, they're not really meant to be out in public a lot. But on the other side, we've got women who we're told participated in battle, who were, these large women who would speak up for themselves, or, there's one woman who was taken and kidnapped and treated quite badly. And when she got away, went up to her men and was like, right, now what are you going to do about it? Go and avenge me. And so we do get these moments that we're seeing women act in ways that Greco-Roman women probably wouldn't have been allowed to. But that's not to say that it was any kind of freely equal society. We do have Boudica as a specific woman we can talk about, and we know that she was leading these uprisings against Rome in Britain because she was denied inheritance to the kingship of her husband when he passed away. And so she does manage to get quite a large force behind her, and actually does do quite a lot of damage before this insurrection is put down. But we can see also how she talked about in the Greco-Roman sources, and see how Rome viewed her. They talk about her as, quote, uncommonly intelligent. They describe her as huge of body with a horrific expression and a harsh voice. So yes, we do get some of these women who are doing things that we don't see Greco-Roman women do, but the way that they're still existing in society, I think if I were to go back into that time period, it would not be pleasant for me.
I think it's so fascinating when they talk about, when one culture talks about another group's, oh, they're so large. And I almost wonder if there is something to that, because it doesn't take a big difference in diet, say, if one group is eating a more healthy diet than another, then they do naturally grow. You can grow taller, and it's not all genetics that, I think that's often what it gets tagged to is, oh, they're genetically superior or something, and that's why they're so much larger. But simple things that probably might not even be under their control, of a better diet or better vitamin or better water sources, can make people healthier and grow to be bigger than other people.
Yeah, that could definitely have an effect on why these Celtic peoples are described as being larger. I wonder if part of it is also, as we think of the purpose for many of these authors writing, are they, trying to just make them more fearsome as an enemy, to go, right, look, they're even just bigger than us, but we still defeated them. So I think there's a lot of questions there as to what all, and I doubt it's one single answer, but what all goes into, why they describe them this way.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack with that. That's really, I think that's probably the most fun part of digging into these sort of things, is there's so much going on.
Right.
I think this last section we're going to do, this is the big part that's going to really transition us into the rest of this series. And it's, what do we know about the Celtic religion, the pre-Christian religion?
Right. So again, most of this is going to come from our Greco-Roman sources. When we get into the next part, there will be other stories, or what we think of as the body of medieval Irish literature, but we have to be really careful in how we approach those, because they were all written down in a context. But what we can kind of get from what we've got and what archaeology we might be able to put together with this is a belief in reincarnation, that they would foretell or prophesy the future, that they would engage in ritual deposition in bodies of water, such as springs, lakes, and bogs. In fact, the Latend site is on a lake. So the story was that the Greeks and the Romans would be amazed by just the sheer quantity of high value goods that would be deposited in these places, and nobody would go steal it. Like, that was unheard of. That's just how sacred this ritual act was, that they used funeral pyres for their dead, that they had sacred sites. So the word nemeton today is really associated with like a sacred tree or a sacred grove, but that originally seems to have been reference to a more general sacred enclosure. And we have found some of these sacred enclosures in the archaeological record, though I'm not sure how they later came to be associated specifically with trees, but that's how we see it later. There's a plaque from Vaison in France that reads, Segomarus, son of Vilu, citizen of Nimes, offered to the goddess Belisama this nemeton, and it was a sacred enclosure. And we can see there are these pits that they would dig in the ground and ritually deposit items in there as well, in addition to the more watery deposits that we'll still get a bit of when we go into the next bit of the series, I think.
One thing, I believe you mentioned it earlier, the bog bodies. Were they associated with the Celts? And if so, was that a religious act?
So there does seem to be some kind of ritualistic association with some of them. We see sometimes what's known as the ritual three deaths that you see in Irish literature. So someone may be stabbed, they may be hung, they may be drowned, all three at once. And that's kind of associated with this sacral or ritual death. So yeah, the bog bodies themselves, I personally don't know a ton about them. I have been to a museum in Dublin and view of them, and it's really remarkable the level of preservation that these people retain. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done on figuring out exactly, what they can tell us or what their deaths may have meant. But it does seem to be that there was some kind of ritual aspect to them. And if we're thinking of a period in which, the bounty of the land is tied to the quality of kingship, if things are going bad, are they going to sacrifice a person or maybe even the king if things are really bad to try to make up for this lack of bounty? I think this is a really useful background to kind of make a base from which we can build in the next few episodes on, and to kind of start shifting our perceptions and our perspectives on who we think the Celts are and how we think they acted.
So I want to thank you so much, Dr. McNamara, for leading us through this initial discussion on the background and origins of the Celts. I know that I am very, very much looking forward to delving into this topic more, especially as we get into the Christian history of these groups. So if people want to learn more about what we've talked about today, Dr. McNamara has provided sources for further reading, which I've included in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will talk to you next time.